afternoon. I'm Peggy Venable, and you're watching Eyes on Texas. This is September 17th, and it is Constitution Day, as I refer to it, and many of us do. But we have a real expert in the studio today, John Rowland, who is the founder and president of the Constitution Society, is in the studio with us, and we're going to be talking about Constitution Day and how that came about and what that means. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Peggy.
Well, it's great to have you here, and we've been excited to celebrate Constitution Week this week, and today, Tuesday, September 17th, is Constitution Day. But just before the cameras were rolling, we were talking about the history of Constitution Day and the fact that it really had a different name. If you could give us a little bit of that history on what we now refer to as Constitution Day.
Well, many of the states were calling it Citizenship Day for many years, and Congress passed a bill designating it as Constitution Day. They didn't make it an official day off type of holiday,
Right.
but they did designate it as such. Then in 2004, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia introduced an amendment which required all schools receiving federal funds to celebrate Constitution Day on or about September 17th of each year, which means that if they don't, they can in principle lose federal funds. So after that, they started taking it seriously.
Well, that makes good sense then, doesn't it? Somehow money talks.
And but they've been very slow to comply. Last year, there were very few schools that celebrated it. A notable exception was our local Austin Community College, and but I've been promoting it across the country. I set up a website, constitution-day.org.
Let me repeat that for folks who may be listening in, because I'm looking at it now. It is constitution-day.org, and then you have on there just a list of events. If they hit on the events tab.
This year, for the first time that I've been able to find, there are events in all 50 states and the District of Columbia that have websites.
Wow.
Maybe not websites of the sponsored organizations, but at least websites perhaps on local media, newspapers or other media, in which the schools have announced it and provided details. So previously it might just be an obscure little entry in a events calendar, but no details. So this year they're beginning to pick up the pace, and I've been putting out word on the internet for people to check with your schools in your area to see if they're in compliance, and if they're not, to remind them that they could lose their federal funding if they don't.
Wow. Well, you've been very successful, and certainly in looking at this list, I'm looking at your website right now, a lot of them seem to be colleges and universities. Some cities and other entities are hosting events. Tell me a little bit about why are the colleges hosting the events? Was the Senator Byrd's recommendation for K through 12, or
No,
was it for
all schools?
All schools, higher ed and
Yes.
K through 12.
Although it's
Excellent.
interesting because the first and second tier colleges and universities are underrepresented in this list. The community colleges and private colleges are much more in compliance, including some who do not receive federal funds.
That's a good point. I do see, though, Texas A&M, College Station,
Yes.
is listed, so that's a top-notch University of Houston, Victoria.
But I haven't found one for
Austin
the
Community College.
University of Texas.
You know, you may not find one for the University of Texas. That's something that we ought to be talking about on another show, maybe, about just that. But this is a very impressive list of events and activities. And you mentioned one of them at Austin Community College isn't taking place today, but next week. Is that right?
Right, next on the 24th. So far, of all the events, such events that I've looked at, they seem to have by far the best.
Wow.
What they do is they gather together several hundred students. They seat them at tables, typically maybe 8 or 10 per table, and then they'll have maybe 2 or 3, 4 tables that are grouped together on one topic. Each group of tables is given a topic, and they sit around, they discuss the issues that associated
So
with
they
the topic.
really talk about aspects of or sections of the Constitution. Wow.
But in particular, current live issues that could come before the Supreme Court anytime.
Wow.
And then toward the end of the program, they get together and pick one person to represent the pro side and another to represent the con side, and then they stand up at the microphone and they have a few minutes to debate, to make their points, arguing for their position. Now there are no winners or losers, but there is a critique in which the debate coach
sounds like you might have had a little bit to do with helping them plan this event, because it sounds like it is a real education event.
Yeah, actually I didn't.
Wow.
I've just been assisting at the tables with the students when they had questions on constitutional points.
Wow. Well, it sounds like a great idea, and you can find out more information about that event and a lot of other events by going to constitution-day.org and then /events. And there's an enormous listing of events around the country. I know, John, that you just came from the Texas Capitol and that you had an event there at the Capitol. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that event?
Yes, it was it involved a number of different groups. We all came together for one occasion. It was on Constitution Day. It was held starting at 1 p.m. Right on the south steps of the Capitol, which is an excellent place to hold such events.
Right.
We had beautiful weather and good participation, and several of us gave speeches and got acquainted and committed one another to continue our work on the field.
That's just super. Well, I know you came here directly from that event, and I want to say thank you so much for doing so.
Yes,
because I know
it's a
you had
short
a long
walk from
day.
here.
It is a short walk to the studio, but it's a warm day, I think, here. Now, tell me a little bit about what you see as the challenges when it comes to our Constitution. So many of us take for granted the Constitution that we have the privilege of living under, but our forefathers really fought to provide us with this framework for American exceptionalism that we have the privilege of enjoying. Tell me how you first got involved and why you created the Constitution Society.
Well, actually, I first read the Constitution when I was 7 years old and became fascinated with it, tried to learn as much as I could about it, long before it came up in public school. But as I grew older, I also came to realize that the government was in substantial violation of it. And that bothered me, but I couldn't find enough other people who seemed to be similarly bothered. So that just gnawed on me, for many years. Of course, in the meantime, I kept learning more and more. Eventually, I joined the Air Force and formally took the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And I'm not going to take an oath unless I take it seriously, and that means learning to understand what this thing is that I'm obligating myself to preserve, protect, and defend, and what it requires of me. So I set out to make myself an expert on the subject. But it was really not so much the massacre of the Davidians in 1993, but the trial of the Davidians in 1994 that was the tipping point for me, because I essentially drew my own mental line in the sand for the government. It says, here's your opportunity to get it right in court.
Right.
When we're out of the heat of battle. But if you violate the rights of the Davidians in the way you conduct this trial, and I made a long list of the ways they could commit judicial and prosecutorial misconduct, then watched as, not actually unexpectedly, they checked off every one of the items on my list and added a few more I hadn't thought of.
Well, let's, just in case our viewers don't remember the Branch Davidian situation and that case, could you, I know we just have a half hour, so I don't want to spend too much on that, but you make an excellent point that that's a great example of where the government overstepped their constitutional bounds. Could you just, for our viewers, give them a little overview what happened in outside Waco at the Branch Davidian compound, and then the resulting action that the government took?
Well, on February 28th, they allegedly tried to serve a warrant, which they did not actually have in their hands, for the arrest of David Koresh, the leader of the Davidians, and the search for illegal, so-called illegal weapons, which would essentially be weapons on which a $200 tax had not been paid. And there were no such weapons at the time, but for some reason, shooting started. We think that what happened was that some of the ATF agents shot some of the dogs, and others thought that Davidians had fired on them when it was really their own agents that were shooting dogs. So they started pouring lead into the building, including at Koresh, who was at the doorway. And then the Davidians started firing back in return, in defense.
So the Davidians had firearms.
Yes. But we think they were not converted to full automatic on February 28th. Now there is reason to think that some of them were converted during the standoff, which continued until April 19th, when the FBI moved in using tanks to knock down the walls of the building, insert flammable gas into the building, and a fire started, which we think was deliberate on the part of the government.
So I guess here we are talking about Constitution Day, and we are that incident came up. But I guess in a bigger picture, that is maybe a microcosm of what's wrong, that our federal government has so overstepped the constitutional bounds that our forefathers had envisioned. And that is, I think, probably not that rare, but a very extreme case of that. I guess many of us that watch Washington and much of what goes on in Washington, D.C. and in Congress and what the president does as overstepping the bounds of the Constitution, I guess some of us would think there's a very infamous situation right now with Obamacare and the Health Care Act. Could you talk a little bit about how Congress and this president may have overstepped the constitutional bounds, or if they have, what concerns you may have now?
Well, of course, it's not just this session of Congress or this president. This is just the culmination of many, many decades. In fact, the major departures from the Constitution started about 1819 with the Supreme Court case of McCollum v. Maryland, and it's been sliding downhill ever since. Now, once in a while, the Supreme Court will recognize some right correctly, but they're only having to do that because they previously wrongly recognized the exercise of some power that the federal government doesn't have. So there's sometimes a backtrack a little bit to carve out a right from a power that they shouldn't be exercising in the first place, but it's been the decisions that sustain powers that have been the main problem.
So the Supreme Court really has the ultimate, I guess, responsibility to make decisions based on whether or not a law or an action is constitutional. And they're human beings appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Or what can we as citizens do to protect our Constitution? And I guess what you might first say is we first need to know the Constitution, right?
Correct. And that's not as easy as a lot of people think, because the Constitution was written in the legal English of 1787, which is not either the ordinary English or the legal English we use today.
Right.
There are also a number of provisions and terms of it which are unfamiliar to modern readers, and which, from the viewpoint of people reading them today, are ambiguous. Now, they were not as ambiguous to the people who wrote them,
Right.
but they had the advantage of several centuries of education in the law leading up to 1787. And almost no one studies that today except a few legal historians. So to backtrack a little bit, after I saw the way the trial was going, I formed the Constitution Society, and later, the following year...
I'm sorry, so we're back to the Branch Davidian trial.
Right.
My apologies, I did take us off that topic. So you're telling us how and what got you really started in establishing the Constitution Society.
Right, I figured that at that point there needed to be an organized effort.
Right.
I also felt that there would be armed revolt on the part of the American people, many of the American people, if this sort of thing continued, and if we didn't organize them to resist constructively. So I set out to build a movement that would return us to strict compliance with the Constitution without the need to resort to violence. And I think I've been reasonably successful in that. I know a lot of people who were disposed to violence who have been turned away from violence toward constructive political efforts.
Excellent.
And when I first got started, when I first created the website in 1995, I found there was almost nothing on the web, the World Wide Web, in the way of constitutional materials.
Now, your website for Constitution Society is what?
Constitution.org.
Okay.
And so I set out, first of all, I wanted to have the documents myself. So
First, let me say, I'm shocked that you got Constitution.org. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
I wanted to have all the documents that anyone would need to decide constitutional questions. And the easiest way to even have them for my own use was to scan them with a scanner, converting them into digital pages, which could just as easily be web pages, which are searchable.
Right.
So I can quickly search through them to find anything I want on any subject. Then, of course, the natural thing was to put that on a website. So I figured that eventually I would be overtaken, that the government or universities or other things would eventually have all this material online, and I could, just
Step back
and link to them.
Right.
Well, that has never happened.
Wow.
They've never caught up. In fact, a lot of them even have mistakes that I have the corrected version on my website that they lack on theirs.
Wow.
So we have not only the most complete collection of constitutional documents, but the most accurate.
That's so amazing. And you've done this single-handedly pretty much, right?
Largely, I have had volunteers helping with the scanning and the corrections and all that, but I usually wind up having to come in and go over their corrections to correct their corrections.
Well, let me ask, since you know so much about the Constitution, and it's something that we all live under and should know a lot about, How versed in the Constitution do you believe Americans are today?
Not at all. I mean, it's pathetic.
And what do you attribute that to? Is it a lack of education, lack of interest? Kind of tell me what your thinking is in regard to that.
Well, it's a lack of commitment on the part of parents and teachers. In the middle of the 19th century, kids were practically asked to memorize the Constitution. We have an example of a textbook from 1854, which was the model for its time. And basically, all it was is a textbook on the Constitution.
Wow.
And
what grade would that have been?
That would have been what today we would call high school or early college.
Right.
Now, when I went to public school, we did have American government.
Right.
In fact, we had a textbook that came right out and said that most of the stuff done under the Commerce Clause would have been considered unconstitutional by the framers. And I said, aha. So there were glimmers,
right,
even then, but
right,
I've done some substitute teaching at the high school and middle school level, and we don't have very much of that anymore. I was also involved in cleaning up the textbooks used by the state of Texas.
right. I remember, that may be when we met,
Yeah.
10 or 12 or
Yeah.
more years ago.
In fact, my testimony is, I made videos of it, and it's online.
Right.
And there was one textbook in particular, you remember that incident. Since 1950, they had been teaching that informal amendments to the Constitution were just as good as formal ones. And when I saw that, I said that either this textbook has to be rewritten or it has to go.
Right.
And they were right up to the last minute until they finally got the author, whose consent was needed, to cave in and agree to rewriting that textbook.
You know, that shows power when you're able to get a textbook corrected that frankly had been wrong for so many years and in dire need of correction. Well, let me just ask this question. What can we do, we as citizens? I'm with Americans for Prosperity, and many of the groups and the individuals that I work with in Texas really have a great respect for the Constitution and want to see our government adhere strictly to the Constitution. What can we do to try to make that happen?
Well, first of all, make constitutional compliance an issue in every election. There's a tendency for people to dwell on policy issues and to neglect the Constitution. But ever so often you have to stand up and say, this policy is unconstitutional. In fact, it may even be a policy that you like.
Right.
You know, I've had to abandon some policy positions of my own because I came to realize they were unconstitutional. But you know what? I discovered
principles
that in almost every case it was possible to solve the same problem within the constraints of the Constitution. And that if you just tried to find a solution that was constitutional, it would almost always be a better solution.
You know, isn't it amazing that our forefathers had this kind of insight? That this document has withstood, or should still be withstanding, all of these generations.
Yeah, but I don't think they realized it at the time.
Right.
They had a lot of doubts about their work product in September 17th, 1787. But
I've read some of that.
I
Let me
think
ask you
a lot of people have come to the conclusion, you don't even have to be a religious believer, that this was divinely inspired.
You answered my question. You answered my
And
question.
I think this comes the closest thing we have to a latter-day scripture.
Wow. You know, very well put. Very well put. Let me just say that it seems that as you've been engaged in textbooks and know pretty much what's in the classroom or what isn't in the classroom across the country today, what can we do to try to improve the education the citizenship and Constitution education going on in our schools?
Well, the first thing is somebody needs to simply go over what it is the government does and review it for its constitutionality and make it clear to everyone, students, teachers, officials, everyone else, journalists, that this is constitutional and that is not. And a lot of it is going to be unconstitutional. And when it's not unconstitutional, they need to be able to explain why. For example, 95% of all federal criminal statutes are based not on the Constitution but on a court decision, Wickard v. Filburn from 1942, which sustained a criminal prosecution of a farmer from eating his own corn that was subject to price and production controls. There is no authority in the Constitution for that.
Right.
And yet, because they had that precedent, now all of a sudden they can seize on the precedent to pass all these federal criminal statutes.
Well, let me just ask you this. We just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to leave our viewers with some nuggets of your wisdom. It sounds like it's it's not a hopeless situation, I hope, but it sounds like we are losing this battle. And you make it sound like this, it sounds like it's a tough thing for us to do. If so many laws are unconstitutional, the federal government is acting outside the constitutional limits, I'm assuming that you're saying that educating the public on the Constitution isn't enough. What do you think needs to be done?
Well, it seemed hopeless when I started the Constitution Society and opened my website. However, so much support has now grown around my efforts and those of many other good people that it's no longer hopeless. Now we have elections in which constitutionalists are actually winning. Rand Paul, Ted Cruz.
Yes.
Perhaps me if I win the nomination of my party for the U.S. Senate for 2014. And
I understand you are on the ballot. That's right.
Well, not yet.
I see. Well, I invited you as in your role as the leader of and founder of the Constitution Society, but I'm delighted for you to share that information with our viewers. So you're saying that we haven't gone too far down the wrong path yet, that we can still turn things around if we get the right people elected to office.
Yeah, but I'm afraid now we're in another kind of situation because of our very poor fiscal and monetary management, not only in this country but around the world. I'm afraid we're headed toward another world depression that will make the one of the 30s seem trivial by comparison. And you recall that one led to a Second World War and to hundreds of millions of deaths. Today we didn't have nuclear weapons then, except at the very end of it. So the stakes are very high, and I'm concerned that if we go into a collapse like that, and we're not prepared to come out on the other side, so that the dictatorship comes to reign over mankind instead of a return to constitutional republican government, that the fire of freedom may finally be snuffed out. Because after that, dictators will have the technological means to control us that they have never had before. In the party in Orwell's 1984 would have loved to have the technology that the NSA does to keep us under control.
Very good point.
Big Brother's telescreens were nothing compared to what we've got now.
But so I guess I feel like people in their hearts so want and love freedom that freedom will have to prevail. But you're saying
it needs preparation.
Right.
Most of what I'm doing, I do not expect to be successful in my lifetime. But I'm hoping to lay the foundation so that after the collapse, people will learn the right lessons from that development and come out on the other side with a better world.
Well, you certainly have accomplished a lot. I encourage people to go to your website, constitution.org. Constitution.org. Wow. We have been visiting with John Rowland. He is the founder and president of the Constitution Society. It is September 17, Constitution Day. We're so pleased to have had you with us. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll be back in just a moment to talk about what's on the November ballot that will cost Texans up to $5 billion. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.